There's a very special little boy here, one who is waiting to leave the hospital for good and go outside.
In the early 1970s, a young boy in Houston, Texas captured the world's attention. His name was David Vedder, a boy born without an immune system. He would come to be known as the boy in the bubble. Year after year, the public watched his life unfold as he grew up inside a sterile plastic bubble, waiting for a cure for his disease that tragically never came. His story is entirely unique and unheard of, and to this day, he remains one of Texas Medical Center's most famous patients. Cameras filmed him, scientists studied him, and even NASA got involved. What began as a life-saving measure became a living experiment, one that would forever change how we think about science, ethics, isolation, and the cost of survival. I'm Brooke, and this is a story of David Vedder, a young boy who spent his entire life inside a plastic bubble, all while the world watched from the other side. David's story starts on September 21st, 1971, as staff at St. Luke's Hospital in Houston, Texas, began prepping their operating room for a birth that was to be delivered via cesarean section. Despite delivering hundreds of babies over the years, this birth would be unlike any they had ever seen before. It was to take place under totally germ-free conditions, one of the first operations like it ever attempted in the United States. In preparation for the delivery, walls were triple scrubbed, windows and cabinets were sealed, and all non-essential equipment was removed from the room. The surgical team was tested to ensure they weren't carrying any germs, and their clothes were sterilized. They wore scrubs, 2 gowns, 2 masks, tennis shoes, and sterile boot covers. At the time, David's mother was a 28-year-old housewife named Carol Ann Vedder, and she was the carrier of a rare genetic disease that could leave her child without a functioning immune system. This meant that doctors would have to deliver the baby without exposing him to any germs. Even one could be fatal. Movements in the OR were kept to an absolute minimum so as not to stir up dust, and the medical team abstained from talking, choosing to instead communicate through a series of eye signals. As soon as baby David was delivered, he was placed in a sterile plastic enclosure called an isolator, ensuring he wouldn't be exposed to the air in the operating room for more than 20 seconds. The isolator was fed a constant flow of filtered air. Attached to the smaller bubble was a 5-foot by 3-foot living chamber. David was handled through neoprene gloves that were spaced throughout the isolator. Everything he ate, wore, or touched had to be sterilized and placed inside steel capsules that were then put through a system of airlocks. As you can imagine, this made caring for David incredibly difficult. In preparation for his arrival, nurses practiced holding and changing diapers on a doll placed inside an isolator. So, how did all of this come about? After all, this wasn't your typical run-of-the-mill labor and delivery. Well, about a year prior to David's birth, in the fall of 1970, immunologist Raphael Wilson had an idea for how to treat a disease known as SCID, severe combined immune deficiency, a rare genetic condition that left babies vulnerable to germs. Prior to 1970, most babies born with SCID didn't live past their first year. By the time they were diagnosed, nothing could be done to save them. But Dr. Wilson believed he had discovered a way to delay the onset of infection in SCID infants. The idea was to create a sterile plastic bubble that SCID babies could be placed in at birth to be kept germ-free. In theory, this would protect the immune system from being damaged by infection until it could be repaired through a bone marrow transplant. Now, while Dr. Wilson had successfully performed bone marrow transplants on immune-deficient mice and had temporarily isolated 2-month-old German twins, he still hadn't been able to test his hypothesis on a baby. That is, until the Vedders came into the picture. David Sr. and Carol Ann Vedder had been undergoing genetic counseling at Texas Children's Hospital. See, the Vedders had a daughter, but had lost a son to SCID when he was 7 months old. And while Carol Ann and David Sr. hoped to expand their family, they wanted to know the risks of having another baby. Since SCID only affects male children, if the Vedders had another girl, she'd be fine. But if they had a boy, there would be a 50-50 chance of him developing the disease. Desperate to have more children, Dr. Wilson began sitting in on the Vedders' counseling sessions. with the two main questions being, could the baby be delivered germ-free? And if he was born immune deficient, could he be treated? Dr. Wilson was confident he and his team could do both. With the full support and backing from Texas Children's Hospital, it wasn't long before Carol Ann was pregnant again. The only thing was, even if the vetter's baby could be kept germ-free, the chances of performing a successful bone marrow transplant were small. Since bone marrow transplantation was still in its infancy, it required a near-perfect match between the donor and recipient. Parents would only be a half match, so they were out. The odds of finding a perfect sibling match were 1 in 4. And finding a match from an unrelated donor was 1 in hundreds of thousands. Still, everyone chose to remain optimistic. After David's successful germ-free birth, he was transported to the Clinical Research Center for testing. A week later, the results were in. David had SCID. Despite the diagnosis, everyone stayed hopeful. See, unlike other SCID babies, David had remained germ-free inside his isolator. After getting the test results, doctors moved into the second phase of the plan, to transplant David's older sister Catherine's bone marrow to him. Because David's brother had been a match to Catherine, doctors assumed David would be too. The only problem was, David and Catherine weren't a match. Dr. John Montgomery, who worked on David's team, said, "I have to be honest that we never sat down and outlined this is what we will do if. It was an unspoken understanding that he would match Catherine, we would transplant him, it would work, and 6 weeks to 3 months later, he would be reconstituted and come out. And we would all be joyful and maybe famous." But now, with no matching donor, it was back to the drawing board. David would need to stay inside a germ-free environment. And just like that, the isolator bubble he had been in went from a temporary shield to a permanent home. Doctors weren't even sure how long it would hold up for. The medical team decided that 3 things could be done. They could leave him in the bubble in hopes that his immune system might kick in. They could leave him in the bubble in hopes that a new treatment might be found. Or they could take him out of the bubble and let his disease run its natural course. At the time, the United States was making major advancements in medical technology. Things like the newly available CAT scan and MRI allowed for early and accurate diagnosis of diseases and internal injuries. Ultimately, the decision was made to wait for a future medical breakthrough. In the meantime, David's doctors learned as much as they could about SCID and sought out ways to perform bone marrow transplants without a matching donor. Not only that, they studied David to better understand the human immune system. For the first time ever, doctors were able to watch the progression of the disease in a human who was completely uninfected by germs and bacteria. David was essentially both patient and research subject. In fact, research grants from the National Institutes of Health provided $200,000 a year for David's care and continued study. Some were concerned that David was little more than a guinea pig, while doctors argued that the situation offered an opportunity to do research in an area that hadn't previously been explored.
Everyone involved in David's care has felt trapped by the situation at one time or another, because we do feel that it's a problem that we can't just turn off and walk away from.
Eventually, David's unique story made headlines. His doctors painted a rosy picture of success, that David was happy, thriving, and that a cure was close at hand.
He seems quite happy and active, with an abundance of toys and love, and that makes the waiting easier.
Cameras and journalists were welcomed, and David's looks and charming personality instantly captured the hearts of the public. At 2 months old, David was allowed to leave the hospital for the first time. After being taught how to use the isolator, an additional one was set up at the vetter's so that he could divide his time between home and the hospital.
For the journey home, David was transferred to a portable isolator and loaded into an ambulance.
Slowly, months turned to years as everyone continued to wait for a cure. Not even the bone marrow registries in Europe had a matching donor. As David turned 3 years old, the original plan to cure him by age 6 months had long passed. David was essentially in limbo, and removing him from the bubble would be disastrous. Naturally, as David grew, so did his needs. He was spoon and bottle fed until he was 3 years old due to concerns over food spills in his isolator. Messes had to be cleaned up immediately to prevent bacteria, fungi, and spores from growing. Because all of his food had to be sterilized, it was either jarred or canned, and all labels were removed for fear they might contain germs. Eventually, David was able to figure out what cans held his favorite foods by their weight alone. Not only that, because he was used to his food being served at room temperature, he wouldn't eat anything that was warmed up. Another issue that nobody had considered was how David would brush his teeth. See, his toothpaste needed to be sterilized. There was just one problem. None of the sterilization techniques would work. Putting toothpaste in an autoclave turned it to concrete, while bubbling gas through it would turn it into a giant bubble and explode the tube. The fix was to brush his teeth using a mixture of salt and baking soda, which was more akin to original toothpastes. Meanwhile, doctors worried about his cognitive development. In the case of the German twins, who were kept in isolators for 2.5 years, it was noted that the boys exhibited signs of cognitive delays that were thought to have stemmed from their time in the bubble, though there was no way to tell that for sure. Now, David's early physical development was advanced. He was meeting all of his milestones earlier than expected. At 4 months old, he could push up on his hands and knees. He could crawl at 6 months, and by 8 months, he could stand by himself and take a few steps. Despite meeting his physical milestones early, David's language skills were delayed. This was most likely due to a lack of hearing consistent speech. To help offset this, a speech pathologist was brought in to work with him. Hospital staff were also trained in language development and taught to verbalize, label, and describe everything they did in his presence, much like a mother would. And their efforts paid off. By the time David was 2 years old, he was communicating at level for his age. At 3, David was 2 years ahead of his peers, and his IQ measured at 126. By the time he was 4, his team had a whole new set of challenges to navigate, mainly how to keep him in the bubble. Not only was David extremely intelligent, he was active and energetic. Everyone feared he may eventually damage the isolator or, worse, try to come out of it. Doctors decided that the only way to control David was to make him fear leaving the bubble. That's when he began to understand just how different his life was from everyone else's. Despite all the differences, the vetters tried to give David a normal a life as possible.
Now, David likes to play in this isolator because of the perfect view that he has to our kitchen, our eating area, the utility room, and onto the garage. He can participate in the activity in the kitchen, and we can converse without me actually being in here.
Show me another kiss.
David's isolator would eventually be expanded to add more rooms. Doctors wanted him to have different areas that he ate, slept, and played in, though the isolator itself had restrictions on what could go in it. Things like paint, glue, and oils were out of the question, as were toys with synthetic oils and lubricants, which included most toys. While cloth, paper, glass, and most plastics could go in the isolator, the sterilization process often damaged them. Holes had to be punched in hollow plastic toys in order to kill any germs inside them. And while David could have paper, he couldn't have crayons or pencils. Just putting supplies into the isolator was incredibly time-consuming. Special tools had to be attached, sterilized, and plugged, all while going through a system of airlocks. The sterilization process alone took 20 minutes per section, and each section had to be sealed, covered, and then untaped before moving on to the next. Because of the sheer amount of time it took to get things in the isolator, restocking it was typically done with bulk supplies. This meant that surprising David with anything new or exciting could take weeks to actually get to him. One time, David's longtime psychologist, Mary Murphy, had promised him a toy car in early October. David didn't actually receive the car until February. The hospital, NASA, and Baylor College routinely monitored for microorganisms in the isolator. The interesting thing is that David didn't remain 100% germ-free. By age 2, 18 different organisms had been isolated from his feces, urine, skin, and saliva. Most either disappeared on their own or were eliminated with antibiotics. The goal then became to maintain David in a disease-free rather than a germ-free environment. Carol Ann did her best to make sure that her son had friends, regularly inviting the neighbor kids into their home to play. As David grew older, he learned how to use the telephone in the hospital by using the two-way gloves in his isolator to dial numbers. For the first time in his life, he had a major connection to the outside world, a connection that allowed for two-way communication. He often called his family and psychologist Mary Murphy. Eventually, Mary put him in charge of managing her son's small apartment building, a responsibility that David loved. He answered tenant complaints, called for plumbers, and reminded tenants when they were late on their rent. It's clear that David's situation elicited strong responses from anyone who learned about him. Reactions ranged from shock and awe to worried and disturbed. On February 26, 1975, doctors held a conference at the University of Virginia to discuss ethical issues surrounding David's confinement. Some worried that he was little more than a prisoner. Others wondered if there should be a padlock on the isolator.
Our case today has to do with a little boy who's been a number of years now in an isolator.
When he was 2 years old, we built this playroom, which has solid plexiglass walls.
Well, I share, I'm sure, with a lot of people here, extreme admiration for the technological sophistication of what's been done for David, but I'm very deeply troubled, as I think many of us are, about when he begins to ask us, what have you done to me?
What is our ethical position if and when David says, as he may well do somewhere down the line, I've had enough, I'm coming out of here, just stand aside?
Having been raised in this from the outset, he can no more think of removing himself from the bubble than shedding his skin.
But perhaps the biggest concern of all was how David would navigate puberty and sexuality. Concerns about his lack of privacy prompted several ideas, including a worm tunnel and a tent, but none could be properly sterilized enough to go in the isolator. Eventually, extra blankets were put in his plexiglass playroom at the hospital so that they could be draped over the table. It was clear that his team of doctors hadn't planned this far in advance.
If you look at what we have done over the past 2 or 3 years of taking care of David, when the problem comes up, we'll solve it.
Well, we're very optimistic about David's problem with all his genius doctors working on his case all over the world. We truly believe that one day, soon, David will be able to come out. And then when he comes out, then I've really got problems. It'll happen soon. It will. There's no other thought but that. And as long as David can remain happy and jolly and very normal and very rambunctious, then we will be satisfied to go on with this indefinitely until they can find a cure for him. And they will not take him out unless they are satisfied that he can live on the outside world.
In 1975, Dr. Wilson approached NASA about designing and building a special suit for David. They agreed. In fact, NASA engineers had built the isolators that kept his environment sterile. Now, they were tasked with developing a custom-made spacesuit that would allow him to safely leave his isolator.
Throughout the development phase, in Space Center shops and laboratories, materials and components were tested, analyzed, and tested again. To evaluate the system under realistic conditions, NASA had to use test subjects that would fit into the child-sized suit. This is 5-year-old Beth Sauer, a completely healthy child who was used for most of the tests.
In July of 1977, after more than 2 years of development, the $50,000 mobile biological isolation system was ready. And it came with a 54-page user manual. Every time David put on the suit, staff had to complete a 24-step pre-excursion hookup and a 28-step suit donning procedure to keep his environment sterile.
The following checkout shall be performed before each use of the MBIS. Okay, CB5 in, CB3 in, CB4 in, CB1 in, CB2 out.
We've made a compact garment, and then in order to give him ventilation, we had to provide air and a power supply for the air.
How much is a child able to move about in the suit?
The child can go as he's within the limitations of his umbilical, which supplies the air and the transfer tunnel, which is used to transport the child into the suit. He has great mobility. It's just like a slight pressure on street clothing.
A life support system was mounted on a lawnmower chassis that filtered air through two 12-foot hoses attached to the back of his helmet. The suit allowed David to walk around the hospital and, for the first time ever, go outside. This was monumental to his development for a number of reasons. See, David saw the world around him as flat and one-sided. To him, everything outside the bubble was 2D. The suit gave him the opportunity to explore and see that objects like trees and buildings were multidimensional. As helpful as the suit was meant to be, there were obvious limitations to using it. For instance, 3 people who were trained to operate the suit had to be present at all times. And the suit's power supply lasted for 4 hours, 1 hour of which was spent getting David into the suit. In total, the suit was used 6 times before being retired. Some reports say that David didn't like the suit and that it was hot and uncomfortable, while others say that David quickly outgrew it. Now, while David had worked with a speech-language pathologist in the hospital, he still needed a formal education. For his first few years, he worked with a tutor twice a week at home. By the 2nd grade, he was calling into a local classroom at Lamar Elementary and listening on speakerphone. This allowed David to participate in class discussions and even compete in spelling bees. Not only that, several children from the accelerated program would come to his house regularly so that David could feel like he was part of a class. In January of 1978, NASA was able to sterilize 2 new items, a mechanical pencil and an exercise mat. A few months later, they found a way to sterilize an eraser. Despite being incredibly intelligent, his visual, spatial, and perceptual development was both intriguing and frustrating to his team. Besides not being able to understand that buildings had more than one side to them, he had difficulty wrapping his mind around the concept of being able to feel the cold. Not only that, he had a hard time grasping the concept of wind. His perceptions confirm that judgments made about depth, distance, and space are based entirely on memories of past experiences. Slowly, David's team of doctors began leaving to pursue careers elsewhere, something that deeply affected the young boy. David became withdrawn, unhappy, and anxious. One of his former nurses said, "You would go in the room and he would just be sitting there, staring into space. You would say something to him and he would respond, 'I don't want to talk. Leave, get out.' There were times when I really wondered, why are we doing this? Why are we putting this child through all of this?" Not only was David grappling with feelings of abandonment, he had to contend with the fact that for him, every day would be just like the next. No freedom and few choices. Despite the media portraying David as a happy, well-adjusted child, some in his inner circle have spoken out about the stark reality, saying he was anything but. David's psychologist Mary Murphy said that in July of 1978, 7-year-old David began to openly discuss his anger. She said he equated loss of control and anger with going crazy, asking her, "Why am I so angry all the time? Why am I angry with people?" She said that anger, what it was and what to do about it, would become one of their most frequently discussed topics. Now, it's important to note that David's family didn't necessarily agree with those who said that David was unhappy and not coping well. Years after his death, Mary claimed that David had asked her to set the record straight and write a factual account of his life. In 1995, she planned to publish a book. Shortly before it was released, however, the Vetters withdrew the written permission they'd given her to write about David, questioning her facts, accusing her of making false claims, and threatening to sue, leading the publishers to drop the book. Nancy Lefevers, a speech-language pathologist and education specialist who was brought in to work with David, said she'd never forget the first time she met David, saying, "I was exposed for the first time to what David's life was like, what he could and could not have, the toileting, etc. I was horrified, not only at the restrictions of his situation, but also at the staff. They seemed to take David's restrictions, his lack of control over the environment, as normal operating procedure, without sensitivity to his lack of privacy or needs as a child, a human being." In the fall of 1978, Dr. William Scherer and Dr. Ralph Feigen took over David's care. Their approach was to lay out all the options to the Vetters and come to a firm decision on what should be done. They also had David examined by a team of psychiatrists, who all agreed that David's mental health would continue to decline as long as he remained in the bubble. David's new doctor suggested removing him from the bubble under controlled conditions and treating him with antibiotics as infections developed. Their hope was that David's immune system would spontaneously generate itself like it did with some patients. The odds of this happening for David, however, were slim. The Vetters and David's previous doctors were outraged over the idea. Doing that meant certain death. Ultimately, the decision was made to keep David in the bubble until a cure could be found. By 1980, David's deteriorating mental health was now generally accepted. He had difficulty self-soothing and maintaining self-control, so much so that his teachers felt his behavior was interfering with his learning. In November of that same year, a meeting was called between 3 of David's original doctors and his current team. Arguments were made about David's mental health and his feelings of despair and hopelessness. His original team, however, didn't believe that things were as bad as the current team were making them out to be. Treatment options and risks were discussed, but ultimately the meeting ended with both sides feeling frustrated. Once it was made clear that experimental treatments were out of the question, on July 31, 1981, Dr. Shearer made the decision to discharge 9-year-old David to his parents' care, full-time, stating that David would no longer qualify as an inpatient of the hospital. He would, however, be permitted 2 stays a year for checkups, 1 week in the winter and 1 week in the summer. Carol Ann and David Sr. would now be responsible for routine isolator care and picking up weekly supplies from the hospital, while the hospital would furnish and maintain the isolators, provide food and all supplies except clothes and toys, pack and sterilize the supplies, and medically monitor David. Now, according to his longtime psychologist, Mary Murphy, it was around this time that David began exploring privately with her the idea of leaving his isolator for good. He knew his odds outside the bubble were roughly 6 months before he would succumb to a virus or infection. Still, it was a risk he was considering, as life inside the isolator was becoming increasingly unbearable. Thinking about living in the bubble for the rest of his life made him anxious, but so did the thought of leaving it. As he got older, his situation only caused him more grief. So much so that Mary said there were times he said he should have been allowed to die at age 3, before he knew what death was. Now, he had to make the choice himself: remain in the bubble or leave and die. In 1983, just as the Vetters' hope had reached an all-time low, word about an experimental breakthrough reached them. A team of researchers in Boston had developed a way to safely transplant incompatible bone marrow. This meant that David's sister Catherine's bone marrow could finally be used to kickstart David's immune system. The only problem was, nobody knew if the procedure was truly effective. It was a chance they were willing to take, and if it didn't work out, the Vetters were told that their son would still be okay. They would just be back at square one.
Hello, everybody. For 12 years, we've known the youngster simply as David the Bubble Boy. But early this morning, doctors operated on David. And our medical reporter, Christy Myers, is with us now with the good news that this operation may mean that David someday can leave that bubble.
On October 21, 1983, exactly 1 month after David's 12th birthday, Dr. Shearer transfused 2 ounces of Catherine's bone marrow into David's body. The procedure itself went fine.
Dripping the bone marrow into David's body took just 10 minutes. He had no adverse reaction.
Abnormal to live in a protected, sheltered environment for one's entire life. And if there's a chance, a good chance of escaping, I think we should take it.
Now it was just a waiting game. 3 days after the transplant, Dr. Feigen and Dr. Shearer stated that they were certain David wouldn't reject it. However, by the second week, David felt that the transplant didn't take, saying, "I would know if it did. I can tell. Her cells are gone." On Friday, December 2nd, lab work revealed a change. Could it possibly be the first cell to be restored? It was too soon to tell. Shortly after, David began experiencing pain in his stomach, tiredness, and a mild fever, something that was frightening to everyone, as he had never been sick before. Dr. Shearer, however, suggested that these were signs that David's immune system was establishing itself. The rest of December was much like a roller coaster, full of ups and downs, with David having good days and bad days. Then, on New Year's Eve, his temperature spiked to 105. Not only that, David was vomiting blood. The isolator bubble only made treating him that much more difficult, It had to go. On February 7, 1984, David, for the first time in his life, was removed from the bubble and immediately wheeled across the hall to a specially prepared sterile room. He was treated with antibiotics and given blood transfusions, but nothing halted the destruction of his body. Doctors believed he had contracted mono. In what must have felt like a cruel twist of fate, at the same time that David's bone marrow transplant was failing, Dr. Shearer performed one on a 10-month-old boy who also had SCID. The baby received a bone marrow transplant, and soon after, his immune system began working. As much as everyone was elated over the baby's successful transplant, they couldn't help thinking that should be David. On February 22, 1984, David fell into a coma. At 8 p.m. that night, he was pronounced dead at just 12 years old. Sadly, those last few days of his life were the first and only time his parents ever touched, held, and kissed their son without a barrier between them. David's autopsy would eventually reveal his cause of death, lymphoma. Catherine's bone marrow had contained traces of the dormant Epstein-Barr virus, and once inside David's body, it quickly spread. His autopsy revealed that he had 150 tumors in his intestines. Doctors now had proof that a virus could cause cancer, and while this discovery did little to help David, that information would help thousands of immune-compromised children in the future. David was buried in Conroe Memorial Park in Conroe, Texas. His grave reads, "He never touched the world, but the world was touched by him." As with anything, David's story sparks debate, with the toughest question posed, was he better off dead? It's a question with no easy answer. His entire existence, from his conception to his life and eventual death, generated ethical issues, heated debates, and medical dilemmas. After all, he was the first human to live his entire life in a bubble. Some say that David became too much of a test subject, while others argued that he got 12 years of life that he otherwise wouldn't have had. David's mother, Carol Ann, said she had no regrets. She said, "I don't have regret and I don't have blame. Any parent who has lost a child wonders if their brief life has meant something to this world. And science has said to me, yes." Having lost 2 sons to SCID and the years of caring for David understandably took their toll on the family. Following David's death in 1984, his parents divorced. Though David only lived for 12 short years, he helped pave the way for groundbreaking research on SCID. In 1993, using his blood samples, scientists were able to locate and isolate the exact gene that carries SCID. They discovered that by altering this gene in the stem cells of babies born with SCID, doctors could cure the disease. University of Houston history professor James Jones said, "If David's life proved anything, it was that love, kindness, and good intentions don't necessarily translate into sound decisions or produce the desired results." I think Professor Jones summed it up best. While doctors solved the technical problems of keeping David alive, they failed to consider the human condition and what would happen with long-term isolation, what it means to truly live, be an active member of a family, have the ability to choose your own friends, make your own decisions. Now, I pass the question off to you. Had you heard about David before today? Do you think doctors were doing the best they could with what they had at the time? Or do you think they were acting selfishly in the name of science? If you appreciated today's video, give it a thumbs up, and hey, while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on the next investigation.